Hi everyone, I'm Shannon Sullivan, and this is my presentation of the paper, The White Habit of Being Untraumatized. And I'll try and talk loudly because I tend to talk softly on Zoom. I won't be able to read the whole paper because I'm going to try and keep it under 30 minutes, just so you know time-wise. If you look at the two-page summary, there is at the top of that page information on where the full paper is forthcoming. So I'll skip or kind of summarize some places. I'll let you know when that happens. So I'll dive in and I'm just going to read it. Sorry, no fancy PowerPoints. Okay, so on April 30th, 2019, the university in the United States at which I teach was terrorized by an active shooter who killed 2 students and injured 4 others. That traumatic event was soon layered with other local, national, and international traumas. The COVID-19 pandemic that we're all familiar with that spread in 2020, the murder of George Floyd by Minneapolis police officers, which ignited worldwide protests for racial justice, and white supremacist pushback against those protests. I'm going to skip some of the introduction that says a little bit more about those traumas, because this paper was written for an international audience, not just a US audience. But I think y'all are probably all familiar with those events. So Stop Killing Us was and is the demand of many Black people in the United States. And I explain a little bit in the paper. I think a lot of what I say here has implications for other people of color and for Indigenous peoples. And I'm going to focus on Black people, but it's not because this experience is unique to them. Anyway, that's in the full paper. Okay, so that's the demand of many Black people in the United States, whether it be the slower death of racist disparities in health or the faster death of police violence. Now, without minimizing the significance of the trauma that these events, COVID, police murders of Black people in the United States, without minimizing the significance of the trauma of these events and the trauma that these events have inflicted on Black people, I want to focus on a different phenomenon in this paper. These traumas help reveal what I will call the white habit of being untraumatized. Using these events as a touch point, my aim here is to access critical phenomenology to analyze the white habit of being untraumatized. My goal is not to attempt to prove, quantitatively or otherwise, that white people have been less traumatized than Black people by events such as terrorist shootings, pandemics, police brutality. Instead, my strategy is to assume for heuristic purposes that white people are not traumatized, generally speaking, in the same ways or to the same degree as Black people are by anti-Black racism. This assumption, my launching point, makes possible an examination of a white privileged habit related to racial trauma that's often overlooked as if it did not exist. After briefly explaining critical phenomenology and the challenge of identifying and describing something that is invisible, quote unquote, invisible to whom, I draw on existing emotional trauma literature to analyze 3 particular features of the white habit of being untraumatized, and those are ontological, cognitive, and temporal. I close by connecting the white habit of being untraumatized with white ignorance and white affective numbness toward people of color. Now, in fact, I'm going to say very little about my methodology here. I'm going to hope you're somewhat familiar with phenomenology as a philosophical method of uncovering familiar, taken for granted assumptions, habits, and norms that structure human experience, and the way in which phenomenology sets aside what Merleau-Ponty has called a society's or a person's natural attitude. Habit is extremely important to phenomenological method. It's important to a lot of my work, important to this paper. So hopefully you're somewhat familiar with that. There's a little bit more in the large paper on that. In general, phenomenological analysis is richly descriptive, and that makes it a very useful methodology. However, because sometimes a descriptive approach to a topic is inadequate, the subfield of critical phenomenology deliberately goes beyond mere description. Critical phenomenology, which includes feminist and critical race analyses, highlights experiences of power and marginalization to demonstrate how familiar habits and invisible norms can be oppressive and often are very visible to many people of color, women, and other marginalized groups. So critical phenomenology explicitly puts phenomenologically rich descriptions to work, investigating how individual and societal habits could be changed for the better. And it also pays close attention to the related question of what counts as better and for whom. Now, it's methodologically challenging to critically analyze something that's so ubiquitous and quotidian that it goes without conscious notice and even seems not to exist. This is true for a lot of habits, a lot of things, but it's true for habits of white privilege. Now, in the case of not being traumatized, the challenge is doubled, I think. Not only is the racial state of not being traumatized so every day for white people that there doesn't seem to be anything there to analyze, but it's also a state of lived experience that's built on a negative. It's a state of not being a particular way. How do we reckon with something that is not? And yet, that's incredibly powerful at the same time, experientially and otherwise. How do we see what is supposed to remain invisible? And how do we hear what's supposed to be ignored? How do we say what's supposed to remain unsaid, at least among good white people? Now, supposed to here means that seeing and hearing, speaking the trauma would challenge the violent status quo of global white supremacy and the dominance of white privilege. Supposed to thus has a great deal of moral, political, epistemological, and economic force behind it. So under this umbrella of critical phenomenology, still doing a bit with the methodology here, my specific approach for addressing these challenges will be to use existing scholarship in the phenomenology of trauma as something like a camera negative. If the phenomenology of trauma describes the positive, in that camera negative sense, the positive experience of trauma as something present and identifiable, that's what positive means here, then its negative should help reveal the experience of not being traumatized. Negative here does not mean a mere absence. By reversing the original image, a camera negative can reveal the significance and the power of what was hidden and seemingly non-existent, as if it were empty space. Now, by reversal, I don't necessarily mean that I will always take the opposite of the positive analysis of trauma, although in retrospect, I think I do that a lot, but I think there could be more to do with this camera negative approach than I'm able to do here. I don't think it's limited to just quickly taking the opposite. In any case, what I want to do is use the positive, recognizable features of trauma. And from the trauma literature, the three main ones I'll focus on are disbelief that the traumatic event happened, a felt unthinkability of the trauma, and the temporal disorganization that trauma produces. So using those features of trauma as devices with which to pry open the negative hidden experience of not being traumatized. The result, I hope, will be an increased understanding of one of the many unconscious habits of whiteness. Now I'm going to focus on emotional trauma, not blunt force trauma, such as a blow to the head, but I deliberately I don't want to use the word physical just for blunt force trauma, because I think emotional trauma is just as physical and embodied as blunt force trauma. Um, an emotionally traumatic event is an event that produces an experience of an unbearable affective or emotional state. And what makes it unbearable is that there's no, it's a technical term, not my term. There's no holding context for the painful emotions. Holding contexts are often provided by intersubjective relationships in which support from friends, therapists, other people serves as a relational home for the painful emotions. In addition to interpersonal relationships, holding context more abstractly, but no less crucially, I think can be provided by impersonal features of the world, which are ontological, cognitive, temporal, etc. Those impersonal features of the world that give the world and the self that lives in them their coherence. So those two can be holding contexts, I think. And I think a lot of those are very important for thinking about white untraumatization. So absent a responsive milieu provided by some form of a holding context, intense emotional pain tends to become traumatic. That's how and when the intensity of pain by itself is not necessarily traumatic, but it becomes so, or can. In other words, intense pain and horrific events do not necessarily produce trauma. Now, here we need to distinguish real quickly between horror and trauma. Horror can acknowledge, I'm going to use that term to acknowledge something that's very terrible. It's not a minor event in life, it's big and it's terrible. And if we don't have that distinction, we can inadvertently equate a terrible event with a minor one. And then in that sense, we might be tempted to use the word trauma to mark the difference between the terrible event and the minor event. And I don't want to use the word trauma to do that. People can experience genuine horror at events in the world without that experience becoming emotionally unbearable and thus traumatic. This means that when trauma does not occur after a painful or horrific event, we should ask, what are the holding contexts that prevented trauma in this case? How do they function and what is their cost? I actually don't do as much in the paper with that as I would like to. That needs a second paper, the holding context that white privilege and white supremacy provide in a nutshell. The question of cost is especially important. Not being traumatized tends to be considered a positive state. And the goal of therapy, for example, is to avoid trauma and or transition a person out of a traumatized state as soon as possible. Now, this makes good sense in that being traumatized is excruciating and impedes life function. But the fact that trauma is painful and debilitating does not necessarily mean that being untraumatized always is desirable, or that the holding contexts that prevent it, that is traumatization, are worthy of affirmation or cultivation. I'll say a little bit more at the end of the paper about this, about that point. Without disregarding the unbearableness of trauma, we can learn something important about whiteness and racial trauma if we temporarily suspend the belief that being untraumatized is always or necessarily a desirable state. What we then can see is that in the context of race and racism, not being traumatized is not necessarily a state of being that people, and white people in particular here, should strive for. We also can realize the high costs of holding contexts for preventing white people's racial traumatization. We can recognize that those exist and hopefully make the decision, the judgment that those are unacceptable. Okay, so let me dive into the 3 points I want to make about the ontological. I'm going to mostly skip the temporal and talk more about the temporal. So ontological, effortless belief that events happen. Ontology concerns reality. It asks fundamental questions about what's real, what exists, answers which are not always simple or immediately evident to the eye or other senses. Trauma is ontological in that it impacts the reality of those who are traumatized. When a person undergoes a trauma, a common effect is for them to disbelieve that the traumatic event has really happened. This did not really happen, as a traumatized person might say. For example, after her beloved nephew died from an accidental house fire, philosopher Gretchen Gusic, and I'm drawing a lot from a crucial article of hers from 2012, and apologies if I'm mispronouncing her last name, Gusic, Gusic, I'll say Gusic. She describes her disbelief in the new reality that her nephew was gone. She saw the deceased body, she attended the funeral, she mourned with her sister, and yet simultaneously she could not believe that her nephew was dead. Her everyday activities with her family based on the knowledge of the boy's death did not fit with her sense of reality, resulting in a paradoxical clash of knowledge and practical behavior. While confusing, this clash did provide a kind of emotional buffer between Gusic and the world. What we learn from Gusic's analysis is that for at least some period of time after a traumatic event occurs, disbelief in the event functions as a kind of defense mechanism, protecting a person emotionally until they're better able to seamlessly believe that the event happened. So, in contrast, what happens when a person undergoes an untrauma? I use the coin or use the term untrauma here to designate a non traumatic event, and in particular to make visible the non traumatic nature of so called regular events in life, which often goes unrecognized. A person who's untraumatized generally doesn't experience a rupture in reality. They're not subjected to a clash between their practical behavior and their knowledge about events in the world. Things happen, and a person can easily go about their day, period. There's no question or internal struggle about concerning what exists in the world, how it exists, and that the lack of struggle is so taken for granted, it can seem strange to even note it. No emotional buffer or defense mechanism is needed to face the reality of daily events. They're just there, taken for granted. And an untraumatized person's belief in them is seemingly nothing of interest or import. It was actually really hard to write this section of the paper. I'm like, what am I even talking about? There's like nothing there. Belief for the untraumatized person is open and accepting of what is happening or has happened in the world. When untraumatized, one easily assents to the world and can say yes, assent to what the world holds open for a person and what's happening in it. I mean, even if it's crappy, getting stuck in traffic or whatever, there's nothing troubling about disrupting reality. Now, in the case of whiteness, the habit of being untraumatized means that a white person does not experience a clash between their everyday behaviors and actions and the events that are occurring in the world. Things happen. Okay, reading this is going to like sound awful, but I'm just going to say it experientially the way it feels in a descriptive way. Things happen. For example, Black people like George Floyd die. And that's part of the regular, if sometimes unfortunate, stream of things. A person goes about her day, it's not shattered. A white person might find the death horrific, especially when watching a police officer kneel on Floyd's neck with a callous expression on their face, but that's different from experiencing it as a trauma. The felt sense of this isn't real, this isn't happening, is not experienced by the white person in question. There's no denial or other psychological defense mechanism in place to buffer the white person for at least a bit from the reality of the event. It fairly quickly and easily seems real. It happens all the time. And even if the white person laments that it's unfortunate or shameful that it happens all the time, it still happens. A fairly easy cognitive affective state of belief, which is often so normal a feeling that one doesn't notice it until or unless it's ripped apart, that state of belief seamlessly stays in place. Now, it can be difficult to provide concrete examples of the ontological dimension of being racially untraumatized because it seems so normal and uneventful. As I said earlier, there just doesn't seem to be any there. However, the seeming absence of a there marks a place to examine more closely. So take the example of going to the grocery store after learning about George Floyd's murder. This is just going to sound so trivial, but it's like a different world to walk in. While untraumatization is experienced in the everydayness of going to the store, which simultaneously exists simultaneously with the reality of Floyd's death. Sorry, let me reread that. White untraumatization is experienced in the everydayness of going to the store, which exists simultaneous with the reality of Floyd's death. Floyd's death doesn't make the grocery trip seem unreal or surreal, even if the white person's sad or horrified or angry about the murder. And at some point in the midst of those emotions, food still has to be purchased so one can eat. Now, of course, this is true for a person who is traumatized by Floyd's death. At some point, that person also needs food to eat. Maybe she even goes to the grocery store herself. But for the untraumatized person, going to the store is not like walking in an altered state or shredded reality. It's easy to experience regular things that are happening. You put your vegetables in the cart, the clerk scans the groceries, announce the charge. The world that the white people move in tends to be intact. And if and when it's fragmented or shattered, it generally is not because of race. Whiteness gives the world to untraumatized white people. It gives the world to them, to us, as real, whole, and unbroken. Okay, the cognitive dimension of untraumatization, smooth congruence of world and self. Traumas, I'm just going to read a few lines about this and move on for the sake of time. And in part of this is because trauma's cognitive effects, you probably already picked that up in what I read. They're a subset of the ontological dimension of trauma. So reality is no longer the same when undergoing trauma. There's the ontological dimension. And a shredded reality interferes with a person's ability to think. There's the cognitive dimension. And that's different than an intellectual failure, like when you misbalance your checkbook or you double the cookie recipe and mess up the baking soda because you're exhausted, whatever. Those failures of thinking occur without any changes, fundamental changes to reality. In contrast, a traumatized person's ability to cognitively understand things is disrupted because of the ontological effect of trauma. Reality has shifted and is no longer the same. So it's a subtle point, maybe an important one. It's one that Gusic brings up in her piece that I'm drawing from. But for the sake of time, I'm going to skip over that one and jump to the temporal effect of trauma and untraumatization. So temporal, comfortable orientation in time. Trauma causes temporal disorientation, making the traumatized person feel simultaneously that time is slowed down and that it's sped up. This tends to occur because of a traumatized person's intense focus on the traumatic event. That event consumes all of a person's attention, energy, and emotion. And it's as if the traumatic event is the only thing in the world that exists. A traumatic person often has difficulty imagining or remembering what life was like prior to the traumatic event. For example, the 3+ weeks that Gusic spent in the hospital with her nephew before he died seemed like an eternity to her. At the same time, however, it felt to Gusic that the phone call from her sister with the bad news about the fire had just happened. The fire felt immediate and newly inserted into Gusic's life, even though it had happened close to a month ago. In a similar fashion, the fixity of a traumatized person's attention makes it difficult for them to form new memories during the period of temporal disorientation. Things other than the trauma do not seem to have much meaning, and thus there often are strange gaps in memory that a traumatized person notices after the traumatic event has passed. with some significant period of time. Just as reality and cognitive ability are out of joint for the traumatized person, time and memory tend to be experienced as unhinged in the midst of a traumatic event and its aftermath. So the untraumatized person, in contrast, enjoys a temporal experience in which time flows smoothly. This allows the self of an untraumatized person also to flow smoothly, so to speak. She's not stuck in a particular period of time that feels simultaneously eternal and recent, forever ago and just now. She's a person with a well coordinated past, present, and sense of a future. She's also multi-minded, rather single-minded. Single-minded comes out in the cognitive portion earlier. So she can be multi-minded, benefiting from a variety of events in the world that have meaning for her and thus that she can remember. She can go to the grocery store and not have a surreal sense of it being simultaneously long ago and just yesterday that George Floyd was murdered. In addition, her memories fortify her sense of self as something coherent and meaningful. She is this particular person with these particular experiences, and they all hang together to form a being that exists because it can be experienced and located temporally. She can remember to consult a grocery list, for example. I mean, it sounds so basic, but and easily identify with the person she was when she composed the list sometime earlier in the week before Floyd died. White people tend to have a different relationship to time because of their racially untraumatized existence. They're able to have a felt sense of a coherently distinct past, present, and future because of their white privilege. They do not appear to be existentially frozen in a particular moment in time, fixated on a single event that takes over their entire lives. And for this reason, their sense of complex mindfulness about numerous events in the world is granted to them by their untraumatized existence as a white person. They flow, they move, they have a sense of existential freedom because of their temporal existence. They can form memories that help secure their sense of self. Their whiteness allows their self, qua their racialized self at least, to be grounded and at ease. I do briefly, by the way, I this paper, one piece of feedback here might be how and where does intersectionality fit into this paper? And I briefly mentioned that in the longer version, but just am not able to do enough with that there. I do recognize how experientially this is affected, as we factor in gender and other things, class especially. It's not just about race, but here for the sake of analysis, I am sort of focusing on race and whiteness, somewhat distinct from those other phenomena. Okay, with that aside. This phenomenological description of white people's relationship to time differs from some other political descriptions of white people's relationship to time that Charles Mills has described white time in really helpful ways that complement but are different for what I'm talking about here. I'm going to kind of skip over those. In a separate piece, I guess it was published about a year ago, I've described white temporality in terms of experiencing time in a kind of linear arrow of racial progression instead of experiencing it sort of more archaeologically or vertically, where past, present, and future coexist and become sort of stacked or layered on top of each other. And so I've described in different ways how I think those different ways of experienced time often are, at least can be, are racially differentiated in terms of how white people experience time. I'm going to skip over some of that for the sake of time, haha. Yeah, I will skip that and get to sort of the upshot, one of the upshots here that I want to talk about, which has to do with white people's affective numbness. So effortless, smooth, and comfortable. These words describe the racially privileged habits of white people due to their racially untraumatized existence. Being racially untraumatized is one of the ways that white privilege operates. It's an unearned and unjust benefit that cushions white people's lives in various ontological, cognitive, and temporal ways. Being untraumatized helps form who white people are qua white and how they respond to and engage with the world, often unconsciously. White people generally know how to live and be racially untraumatized without thinking, as the cliche about habit goes. And even though it's a cultivated way of being, white people tend to experience racial untrauma as natural and ordinary, and thus also the racial trauma of Black people is experienced by white people as excessive or unnatural. And probably more deserves to be said there on that point too, by the way, but I don't have time here. So These descriptions of white people who are racially untraumatized, they might not sound like typical emotions such as sadness, anger, or joy, but they are affective states. And these ontological cognitive temporal features of white untrauma operate via emotions and other affective relationships to the world. All the stuff I've been talking about with a smooth and easy relationship is affective. And at the same time, being untraumatized is characterized by an absence of certain emotions. So, what's missing, we might say, is precisely when a white person's untraumatized, what's missing is precisely the affective strength of the traumatizing for others situation. The racially violent situation does not make much of an impact on a white person. Its punch does not have much force. As racially untraumatized, white people tend to be affectively numb. And I'm drawing here on some really important work from by Jose Medina in 2012. Affective numbness. White people are unable to feel with people of color because of a cultivated lack of interest in them. And so the fact of white people's affective numbness addresses an important question, I think. I've been assuming that white people are generally untraumatized by racial violence against Black people, but why are they untraumatized? Why doesn't trauma occur for many white people when they learn about, say, Floyd's death, et cetera? And one answer is that from the perspective of white people, there's nothing alarming that has happened, and thus nothing that would or could cause trauma. White people are generally numb to the situation, as I've said. And as Claudia Rankin has argued, for white people, it's no big deal to see corpses all over the place. That is, the corpses of Black people. They're used to that. As long as Black people are seen as subpersons, now keying off some of Charles Mill's work there, you'll probably recognize that. As long as Black people are seen as subpersons rather than full persons, there's nothing particularly traumatic about their deaths. Maybe unfortunate, maybe horrific, not traumatic. Not recognizing or feeling the suffering, pain, and trauma of Black people, as well as other people of color, Indigenous people, that is a key part of the racialized ignorance that's required to be white, again, drawing from some work by Mills and others. This is an ignorance that's not an accidental gap in knowledge, but it's carefully cultivated. And in this way, the white experience of being untraumatized complements white people's habits of erasing the suffering of people of color. Like flip sides of the same coin. And I can't say much here. I've referenced some other work that I and others have done, but the white erasure of non-white suffering is like the flip side of this coin of white experience of being untraumatized. And I believe they're structurally related. To be a white person is required not to know cognitively or effectively the racialized trauma, current and past, near and far, that feeds into a white person's life and sustains her existence. Now, I'm gonna try and wind down here if I can pretty quickly. So in general, the openness and acceptance of untraumatized belief can seem very psychologically and emotionally healthy, and I referred to this briefly in the introduction. Rather than erect defensive barriers to understanding reality, wouldn't everyone want to live in a state of untraumatized openness and receptiveness to the world? I mean, wouldn't everyone want a stable cognitive and temporal relationship to themselves and the universe? And assuming that the answer to these questions is yes, overcoming the disbelief of traumatization would be an important step on the road to recovery from whatever the trauma is, moving beyond the paradoxical clash between the reality of events that have happened and what one is emotionally capable of believing is important. However, the particular case of white untrauma demonstrates, I think, that the untraumatized state of effortless, smoothless, and comfortable relationship to the world, that is not always a phenomenon to be affirmed or aspired to. Affirming it in this case is to endorse a destructive state of existence made possible by white privilege, white supremacy, and anti-Black racism. Much of white people's psychological and emotional health is built on these oppressive foundations. For these reasons, white healthiness, whether ontological, emotional, et cetera, should not be used as the yardstick by which to measure human health. And here I really think critical philosophy of race has really interesting connections to make with the health sciences and medical sciences. It should not be embraced as the existential norm to which Black and other people of color should aspire, and it shouldn't sit unchallenged as a supposedly racially neutral, healthy state of being. This white state of untrauma is a racially privileged existential state available generally restrictively to white people only, and it's not healthy. Put another way, both medical and layperson understandings of what counts as existentially and psychologically healthy regarding trauma need to be rethought through a critical whiteness lens. I have a little bit more of a conclusion in the long paper that I'm going to skip because and I at least briefly do say something about, yes, I think this connects with racial justice. If it's not just white navel gazing about the psychological existential state of white people, I do think transformation in white people's relationship to untraumatization could make a significant difference in terms of white people's capability and effectiveness to meaningfully participate in racial justice movements. So I do think this is a gear that turns some wheels, and I say something at least in a little bit more depth in the longer paper. So thank you for your time. I'm going to stop now. And as I said, there is a 2-page summary of the paper that if you didn't use it to follow along, you can access now if you'd like, and it has the full citation information for the longer paper at the top. So thank you, and I hope to see you at the discussion that we have in the conference itself, and have a good discussion and listen to your questions. Okay, thanks, bye.